All right, folks. Well, I'm really pleased and honored by being joined today on Healthcare Unfiltered by Tara Haelle, who has generously accepted my invite to come on the podcast to talk a little bit about vaccine hesitancy. We're probably going to tackle a wide array of topics pertaining to vaccines and hesitancy. And I thought this topic is really relevant because I'll admit, I didn't think we'll be talking about this a couple of years in and a year after the vaccines, but that is where we are. And what struck me is a tweet thread that she actually did probably almost a month ago now, and we'll put that in on the link. Tara, welcome to Healthcare Unfiltered. I know you're always busy, so I appreciate you taking some time of your busy schedule. You have a very impressive and a long list of accomplishments and so on that my listeners and viewers could definitely see on your website. But tell us a little bit about you and what you do and how do you spend your day?
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to be here. I am a science journalist, and I have been reporting on infectious disease, vaccines, vaccine hesitancy, medical research, broadly speaking, pediatrics, women's health, those main areas for about 13 years. I actually, it's kind of funny. I got into this because I was in grad school for journalism, and I had my son while I was in school. And I found that I had lots of questions about vaccines. And because I was in school in my journalism graduate program, I was able to persuade one of my professors to let me kind of use the whole semester to sort of investigate vaccines really in depth. And I audited an epidemiology class, and I took a medical ethics class. I kind of really threw myself into it and interviewed people all across the spectrum. People, the extreme anti-vaccine people, the sort of in-between people, the people at the CDC. And that ended up becoming part of my my master's thesis. That's what that grew into. And so I kind of have been doing that ever since. And a lot of that has been including spending time in what I call the trenches of the mommy wars, right? Where, breast versus bottle or circumcision, or, anyone who's a parent who's been on social media with these questions knows how intense those questions get. And it really pushed me to dig deep into the evidence and sort of find out the answers to these different questions, and to recognize that there's not clear answers on some of them. So some questions have really straightforward answers with the evidence, and some of them, the evidence is more circumspect, right? It's not, it's more equivocal. We're still gathering data, or there's just not a straightforward answer. And so it was during this time that I encountered lots of people with vaccine hesitancy and recognized that they weren't all the same. First of all, they had different concerns, different anxieties, different worries. They dealt with them in different ways. Some people delayed vaccines, some selected vaccines and skipped others. Some people wanted to get all of them, were scared to, there's all different kinds, some spread them out. And I started learning, as I started digging into this and talking to experts in vaccine hesitancy, I very quickly learned that I needed to talk to social scientists, that it wasn't just, it wasn't infectious disease or pediatricians folks. And that's when I started to learn about cognitive biases. And I gradually put together how much the things that, let me define quick what a cognitive bias is. When you are driving your car down the road and you're noticing things, right? You notice like the squirrel that's about to cross the road, or you see some kids on a lawn that are throwing a ball to each other. You notice those things because they're the things that might present a hazard to you, right? Because the ball might go into the street or the squirrel might cross the street, but you don't notice every single squirrel on every single tree. You don't notice like kids in the windows. You don't read every single street sign. You don't read every single store sign because you don't need that information, right? Your body doesn't need it. And if your brain were to take in all of that at the same level, you would have sensory overload. You would not be able to live because you'd be paying attention to everything. So that's called a heuristic. That's heuristics. It's that selective attention. And we need that to survive. If the cavemen went out into the forest to go hunting and they paid attention to every single monkey, bug, and spider, they would miss the snake they're about to step on that's going to kill them, right? So they have to have that. The problem is that when we develop that, it turns into biases where our selective attention, there's different ways that our brain directs our attention that can cause us to miss things that are important. and things that we don't perceive in the way that we would normally, want to perceive them if we were thinking in a strictly rational way. A robot would be able to sort all that out with algorithms, but our brains don't work like algorithms do. And so it's sort of like this more, like a spaghetti bowl mix of stuff that's rational, emotional, cognitive biases, all kind of mixed together. And I know I've just sort of rambled. I went from who are you to jumping right into it all. Sorry.
I
I
know.
also ramble a lot. But to go back to me. Okay. So I've written a couple books, one vaccination
I was going to
investigation.
say, I mean, you've
Yeah.
done this for a while. You've had a couple of books. Yeah.
Yeah. And then another one was The Informed Parent, which I co-wrote with Emily Willingham. She's an evolutionary biologist and science journalist. And we basically looked at all those questions, like what does the evidence say about all these things? I've written a couple science books for kids as well. And I have done a TED Talk on vaccine hesitancy, which kind of goes into sort of an overview of these different cognitive biases. And just a personal thing about me, I live in Texas, in the Dallas area, with my husband and 2 children and 4 dogs and bearded dragon, and as of today, 14 rats.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
My husband, he agreed to 2 new rats, and I came home with 3, which is kind of
what's the story behind the rats?
I love the little suckers. They're adorable. They're very similar to they're not quite as smart as dogs, but they are actually very smart, and they have individual personalities. And so we have like 2 rat mansions in the area that is my office / the classroom for the kids. It's not really my office anymore since our kids are at home now. But yeah. So we have I just got 3 little girls, the new girls. So
and you have a lot of information about you. What's your website?
It's my name, TARAHAELLE.net. And it's actually kind of still under construction a bit. Like there's good information on there, but it's not complete yet. So apologies to people who are looking at it. I'm still kind of working on parts of it.
And I know you blog and write for Medium,
yes.
and I don't know if you're still doing some stuff for Forbes and other.
I used to write for Forbes. I don't write for them anymore. And I'm thinking about taking some of my old Forbes pieces and moving them over to Medium as sort of like a flashback, blast from the past article. Because I'm just to be completely transparent, my work when I was at Forbes was monetized, but only back to a couple of months. And my work at Medium is monetized. And so I'd rather people read my stuff at Medium than at Forbes. Yeah, well, we're all hustling, right? I'm going to be totally transparent about that.
It's totally fair. It's capitalism. Hey.
Mm-hmm.
So what I want to talk to you about, Tara, is really the subject of vaccine hesitancy, because there's a lot we can talk about, right? I mean, and it's impossible to cover everything in 1 hour, but we'll see what we can get to. But really, the umbrella of what I want to discuss is vaccine hesitancy, and really how we link that to some of the behavioral and cognitive biases, but also maybe some of the lessons learned from the pandemic, because I think that at least as an observant, I feel there are a lot of issues that were done wrong, and some of it.
Oh yes, right. Forget a novel. You could write an encyclopedia.
Yeah, but some of it is also communication, the way things communicated. I think some public health officials could have done a better job. There's a lot of things going on. But I want to go back to vaccine. Let's start with vaccine hesitancy, because you actually have worked on this way before the pandemic. I mean, I listened to your TED Talk from 2016 that was on your website. So you're not one of those individuals who basically you have not risen to fame about vaccine hesitancy because of the COVID-19. This is something you have studied and worked on. Did this start when you had your child? Like, is this the reason that you wanted to invest? Like, how did this start?
Yeah, that was basically where it started, because I had my son in 2010, and he was, I was pregnant in 2009. So my quest to learn things was in 2009, but I tell people this all the time. I refused the hepatitis B vaccine when my first son was born. The hepatitis B vaccine is recommended on the day of birth. And I had not gotten far enough in my research that I felt comfortable giving him a Hep B vaccine on the first day. I was like, what is the point of this? I don't understand. And I joke because my second son, who was then born in 2014, I think I asked the doctors 3 times, did you give him the Hep B shot yet? So I mean, for, you know, it made and I was actually in the midst of writing my book, The Informed Parent, when I was pregnant with my second son. So I was kind of very much immersed in the evidence anyway at that point. But what I found, 2010 is when the Lancet article published by Andrew Wakefield, the discredited gastroenterologist from the UK, who connected the MMR, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, to autism, fraudulently so. That was the year that his Lancet article was retracted in 2010. And it was right when I was learning about all of this. I think it was 2010, it may have been 2011, but and there were a lot of headlines about that, but there had already been headlines for several years saying, this study shows no link between autism and MMR. This study shows no link between MMR, and I was concerned about my child's health, obviously, like so many people are. And so I wanted to dig into it. And as a journalist, I had the advantage that we're sort of trained to be suspicious of everybody, first of all. We're trained to be, to root for the underdog, if you will. We're trained to look at everything as skeptically as possible. And so I wanted to talk to everybody. I talked to, I met the founder of the National Vaccine Information Center, which is one of the largest anti-vaccine groups in the country. I've spoken with RFK Jr. I've interviewed Sherry Tenpenny, the people who are kind of considered the very fringe individuals. And then I also spoke with people at the CDC, and I spoke with Paul Offit, who, was the co-developer of the rotavirus vaccine. And then I spoke to people who posited themselves in the in-between spaces, like Robert Sears. So I talked to as many people of these as I could and tried to kind of piece together the landscape, if you will. So it was less, at that point, it was less about the evidence than sort of learning who the players are and where they fit on this landscape. Then I started to look at the evidence that each of them was sharing with me and putting it together. And because I was auditing a class in epidemiology, because I was taking the medical ethics class, and I had started writing at this point for medical studies, I realized how much I didn't know about medical studies when I was reading them. And I think that's a really important point, because a lot of people start looking at these studies, and every single person I spoke to would point to studies. I mean, Sherry Tenpenny, who is she's about as fringe anti-vaccine as you can get. She's even listed as one of the 12 sort of, disinformation dozen folks. She will give you a list of 30 studies showing that vaccines are dangerous. And I looked at those 30, well, now it's a lot longer, but I've looked at those studies, and the vast majority of them do not say what she thinks they say. And I don't know if that's intentional, if she knows that and is being dishonest, or if she really just doesn't understand how to read. I don't know. I don't speculate on people's motives in that regard. But she was misrepresenting, whether intentionally or not, what those studies showed. And I learned very quickly how much I didn't understand about reading medical studies. So I started to work on that. I went to a course called Medicine in the Media at the National Institutes of Health, where I spent 4 days immersed in learning how to read a medical study and what the difference was between relative risk and absolute risk, and what a p-value was, and what confidence intervals meant, and all of that, and methodologies, and different types of observational studies, and different formats for our randomized controlled trials, all of that. I also did a CDC fellowship where they kind of went over similar things. And I was a member of the Association of Healthcare Journalists, and I am now their core topic leader for medical studies, which means my job for them is to teach other journalists how to read medical studies. I do that every year. I've been doing that for about 6 years. So it was my discovery of how much I didn't know. There's a quote of me, there's an article in the Open Notebook, which is aimed at science journalists, which talks about reading medical studies. And there's a quote in that article where I say that I showed up at an Association of Healthcare Journalists workshop on reading medical evidence and listened and went, oh my God, I'm doing this all wrong. And I didn't know what I was doing. And I think what's really important is journalists are comfortable learning that they're screwing things up, or they should be. Good journalists are. There's certainly ones who aren't. And when you have that humility to recognize that you don't know what you don't know. And okay, now I know what I don't know, so I have to learn that stuff. You invest the time that you need to. If you're going to cover that topic, the responsible thing to do is invest the time learning what you need to know. And once I did that, I could look at those studies that all of those people were sending me and put together the evidence myself. And if I had questions, I could ask a wide range of people. I spread out who I asked about, and it became really clear that, okay, there are people misrepresenting this evidence. There's other people who are accurately representing it. And there's some people who are vaccine evangelists that are not actually very helpful because they don't acknowledge the risks of vaccines. And once I had a sense of all of that landscape and that evidence, then I'm kind of rambling again. I'm sorry.
But I guess, Tara, what's missing in this, in listening to you, I guess, the reality is, when you were pregnant and you were about to have your child, you decided that you can't trust, at the time, face value, the CDC and public health officials, and you went into doing your own research, and then you came to a conclusion that this is what I should do. But the reality is, not everybody knows how to do the research. B, they may not have the bandwidth. Why didn't you trust the public health officials and the CDC back then? What was going on that made you even decide, I don't trust them, I want to do my own research?
Very good question. That actually gets to the heart of vaccine hesitancy, which is all about trust. Part of it probably was that I was a journalist. We're trained to not trust anybody. And like I said, it's funny because another journalist who writes in this space, Melinda Wenner Moyer, she's been fantastic. I recommend her work. She's got a great new book out. And she and I talk a lot about this stuff because we cover a lot of the same things. She actually came to covering vaccines the same way I did, where she was suspicious about it and wanted to kind of, hear it. I think the reason, first of all, journalism itself played a role in how I felt about it. There's a really great article by Curtis Brannard at Columbia Journalism Review called Sticking with the Truth. And it explores how the media contributed to vaccine hesitancy for a good 10 years, where the reporting used false balance. False balance is where you treat two different perspectives as equal when the evidence strongly favors one and not the other. So it's like, okay, here's what this parent has to say, and here's what this doctor has to say. And then you treat those as equal when they're not equal. Or you quote one pro-vaccine doctor and one quote unquote anti-vaccine doctor without acknowledging that the anti-vaccine doctor represents like 0.01% of all doctors. So that's what false balance is. We saw it a lot with climate change as well, right? You quote one climate skeptic and one global warming, proponent. And that, I think, is where the source of a lot of my mistrust came from, because I had spent 10 years casually happening to see it at the corner of my eye, autism, vaccines, autism. And I never paid close attention because at that time I wasn't a parent, but it was there, right? It was in the background. And that sowed the seed of that mistrust. I think the fact that journalists presented that information very poorly and did not also explain how scientific research works, right? The fact that, it's an iterative process. It's not like you do one experiment and boom, you have the answer. Eureka is not how it works. It's a slow process, and it takes years to go through and test things and replicate studies and do different versions of it. And so all of that, I think, was in the background. And then there was the fact that I actually had a lot of trust in the CDC, to be honest. I had been vaccinated myself. I had gotten my own vaccines when I traveled overseas. So I didn't have any good reason not to. The thing that caught me the most was how many vaccines there were. And I think this happens to a lot of people. I was vaccinated with the standard ones back in the 70s, which were the MMR, the polio, and the DTP. Today, we have more than twice as many of those. And so the first thought in your mind is, oh my gosh, that's a lot of little needles going into my little baby. Do they really need all of those? I'm okay. I didn't, I didn't have that problem. I didn't have to worry about those things, which, by the way, is survivorship bias, right? I survived, so I didn't have those, and I'm okay. It's the classic car seat, right? Like I sat in the front seat of my parents' car when I was 3 and didn't have a car seat, and I'm just fine. Well, yeah, but all the 3-year-olds who went through the window aren't here to tell you so. So there was that. So it was the too many too soon argument that got me, and that was so the combination of personal experience. I had this many, but not that many, of the media coverage of it, of the natural inclination I have to sort of, question authority in general and question everything. And that is a vaccine type right there. There's different sort of within vaccine hesitancy, there are different types of thinking in people. And one of them is sort of like the contrarian who just questions all evidence, period, right? Regardless of where it comes from. So I think it was all of those things together that made me, it's like at my heart, I thought the CDC was mostly right. So it wasn't like I thought the CDC was involved in a conspiracy or was trying to deceive me. Instead, I worried, I think, without realizing the term for it, that maybe they were all just so excited about vaccines that they hadn't done adequate research like they should have, right?
Right.
Which was actually now that I think of it, that's a pretty hubristic way of thinking, right? Like here I am, like this little mom, and I think I might, I think all this collection of doctors and scientists who've dedicated their lives to studying all this might have missed something important. Now I look back on that, and that there's a lot of hubris there. But at the time, you're focused on your little baby. And like, Paul Offit, who is a big vaccine advocate, and like I said, he developed the rotavirus vaccine. He's at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He will say vaccine is a fundamentally violent act. You're sticking a bunch of needles into this little child that you don't know what's in them. And that's scary. Now, today it's COVID vaccination hesitancy. We want to say that's different, but it's really not. It's
let's talk about that, because I think that's a very good segue, because I mean, when the pandemic started, I know I'm not a vaccine scientist. I did not think we'll have a vaccine in a year, frankly. I mean, if you think
nobody thought that.
Right?
That blew my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the pandemic, if we think March 2020, we probably had vaccines by the end of 2020. And as you were following the development of these vaccines and what's going on, two questions come to mind for me. Number one, whether you expected there would be some hesitancy, and number two, which I want to really spend more time on a little bit, is to how much of having so many opinions by anybody, especially on social media when it gets disseminated, contribute to this. And if you recall, Tara, one of the things that I recall I was actually upset about, I don't know if you were upset as well like I was, but there was this, it was obviously an election year, so politics were like big thing, but there was a letter that was written by over 100 scientists, including Eric Topol, one of the scientists who wrote this huge letter that was directed to Pfizer, one of the manufacturers of the vaccines, telling them to slow down. Don't actually manufacture this until after November, because we want to make sure safety and all of these things. And it makes me wonder, so many of these similar examples that were, I think, politically motivated, frankly, because nothing magical was going to happen after November 3rd except the elections.
Right.
How much does this, in your opinion, so there's the vaccine hesitancy, which we know, like you talked about, the science, the autism, whatever people were thinking. And then in COVID, we had the additional element to it, which is the politics. These letters were written all over. And I think we came in full circle where, of course, there will be more hesitancy with all of this together. Take me through your thought process as you were witnessing this in real time. And I bet you were telling people, well, I know what's going to happen.
somewhat extent. First, I want to say that I was just talking a lot about vaccine hesitancy with childhood vaccines, right? The COVID vaccine hesitancy, I think a better analog for that, there's a lot of echoes from what we see in childhood vaccine hesitancy, but you have to go back to smallpox, when smallpox vaccines were being recommended, because those were recommended for everybody of all ages, right? And one thing that I think is really interesting that people don't realize is how much of this is not new. And when I say not new, I don't mean like, oh, this is like the 80s when we had concerns about DTP, or this is like the 2000s with autism. I mean, this is what we were hearing in the 1830s. This is what we heard in the 1890s. Like if you go on to newspapers.com and type in anti-vaccinationist, it will blow your mind how many, in some cases, almost verbatim, like the words are almost verbatim for some of the arguments that are used. So there's certain themes in vaccine fear mongering, I'll say, or fears about vaccines that have echoes that kind of go back centuries. And it's the same, they're tweaked a little bit, but the core fear is the same. So in that regard, anybody who was studying vaccine hesitancy, we knew that vaccine hesitancy was going to occur with COVID. Now, I will admit, I expected it to take longer to show than it did, but that's partly because I didn't expect the rollout to go so quickly, to be honest. If you go back on my tweets and you look for this, you'll find it. I'll say our first problem is access, not hesitancy. And it wasn't that I didn't think hesitancy would be a problem. I did, but I thought that access would be the biggest problem in the beginning. And I still think it was. Access was a huge issue. And we actually started focusing on the hesitancy before we had even addressed the access issue. And that's an important distinction because access can be mistaken for hesitancy. Inadequate access is sometimes mislabeled as hesitancy. And I say that because access means not just, do you have the physical ability to go in a vaccine? To me, access means, do you have the ability to get to a vaccine conveniently, easily, and with somebody that you trust who can answer your questions about it? That is true vaccine access. And so if you don't have that, it's not necessarily that you're hesitant, it's that you don't have good access. So that's one problem I saw early on in the pandemic, was that conflating access and hesitancy. I was anxious about how quickly the vaccine trials were occurring. I did think that they were moving really fast. And a lot of us were, a lot of people who were in vaccine scientists were, if you go back and look in things that we said and did in 2020, it was like, wow, this is going really fast. I'm a little uneasy about it. Here's what we should look for. But once the data came out in December and we started looking at it, I was impressed. I was like, dang, they did it right. They had a good number of people, a huge number of people involved. They looked at this, they looked at that, they paused when they needed to pause. And when I looked at the data, it became really clear they did not skip steps as we were, as some people, including myself, were afraid they might. They really did it right. And I think part of that was because Pfizer, Moderna was new to the game, but Pfizer's been in this game a long time, right? And people can say, oh, Pfizer's part of big pharma and therefore I should be more suspicious of it. Okay, Pfizer's also been in this game a long time and has more experience and knows what it's doing. So when I actually saw the evidence, my concern about the speed went away because I already knew the steps that had been supposedly, quote unquote, skipped were the parts where you have to get funding in between, or I'm saying, like the administrative and logistical stuff, not the science stuff. And another thing people don't realize is normally when you do vaccine trials, the reason they take, a couple years is because the disease that you're protecting against is not super prevalent. And so you have to, there has to be time for enough people in both arms to be exposed to the disease and for you to have enough disease cases in the placebo arm. Well, COVID, we didn't have to worry about that. COVID was everywhere. So it did not take long for a lot of people in the placebo arm to get sick. And because they got sick quickly enough, in a way, our inability to control the pandemic early on is why we got a vaccine so quickly, because, it didn't take long to get enough people sick. So I think all of that is important to recognize. And I've forgotten the second part of what you said about
I think there was, because
the politics.
Well, it's the subject of vaccine hesitancy, and I always think some of it is messaging. And I don't know if you recall this, but there was this letter that was written by over 100 scientists, and some of them, again, they're saying now they're pro-vaccines. That the letter was dated September 29, 2020, and was really asking literally Pfizer to wait until November, like literally by date.
Yeah, and I think that
weird and odd, right?
Yeah, that sounds very suspicious to me as well. I mean, it's hard for me to say if that contributed to hesitancy or not. It's quite possible it did. But it definitely sounds politically motivated, because what it should come down to is what the data shows.
Right.
And we didn't have a lot of great data in September. So I would say September was far too early to say what you should or shouldn't do, because you have to have the data. Everything goes around the data. And to say you should wait before you've even seen the data to know if it's good or not, I can't imagine another, I agree. I think maybe like trying to deny Trump the quote unquote win of having a vaccine very quickly may have been a motivator there. I mean, I'm no fan of Trump,
Yeah,
but the
no,
fact
I
of the
mean,
matter is,
I mean, I recall I was a little bit surprised when I saw the letter. It was actually on Twitter, was posted, all of that stuff, and then what was so odd is, I mean, if you recall, the election was, I don't know, was a Tuesday or a Wednesday, and then 2 days later was the Pfizer data came out. It's like just, again, I'm trying to think, because you're very interested in the cognitive bias and the
right,
behavioral piece, right? And again, we all know that you got the US, who's a huge melting pot of all kinds of people.
right.
If you think of just an average Joe who's watching this, it makes me wonder whether this contributes to it or not. And I don't know the answer to this, but as an
Yeah.
expert in cognitive bias, it makes me wonder whether you think it added anything to it.
Well, I mean, it's impossible to separate it all out, because one of the things about cognitive biases is they don't operate in isolation. It's not like you can say, oh, I'm subject to confirmation bias here, and I'm not subject to omission bias or survivorship bias, or they all kind of mix together. I mean, you can label certain arguments, excuse me, as driven by a specific bias, and you can point to individual biases that contribute to a person's hesitancy, but it's never one thing. It's never like, oh, you have survivorship bias, let me correct you of that notion, and now you will want to vaccinate. That's not how it works. I often compare the decision to vaccinate after having strong hesitancy as converting religions, and that's not too it's not a great analogy, because I don't mean to demean people's faith or suggest that you can just trade faiths. It's to point out that when you have a faith that you are invested in, you are deeply invested in it from multiple levels, and it's not, you've made a cognitive decision to have faith, right? Faith is to make a belief in something with the absence of evidence, right? The whole idea that you need evidence for faith doesn't make sense. So you've made that cognitive decision, but you have emotional and community aspects of that. And with vaccines, it's similar. Like, you might have cognitive beliefs about that vaccine that were conscious, but there are emotional ties to that and community ties to that. And nobody changes I hear a lot of people say, oh, well, I talked to my friend and they're just refusing to vaccinate. I had a long conversation with her and she's still not convinced. Well, you're never going to convince somebody to vaccinate in one conversation. I've never done that in my life, and I've persuaded dozens and dozens of people to vaccinate. I also have done almost none of those by myself. It usually takes multiple people who are involved, not intentionally, but it's like, one person says this, another person says that, and they start to explore on their own. It's always a process. And I think that's really important to recognize, because that's why I don't give up. In the case of the politics, I think politics definitely plays a role in vaccine hesitancy, no doubt. I think what makes it tricky here is that political identity became entwined, and this had been going on for a while. This is not brand new, with vaccine attitude identity, if that makes sense. In other words, your belief about vaccines became entwined with your political identity, so that if someone addressed your belief about vaccines, you took that as an attack on your political beliefs. And when you feel attacked, you immediately, you dig your heels in, and you're the hair on the back of your neck goes up. You're like that cat, right? That gets like the tail in the air. And that's a natural human reaction. I don't mean that demeaningly. And I don't know if that letter or things like that contributed to explicit vaccine hesitancy, but what it probably did do was just enhance the existing us versus them that existed. You know, that binary dynamic of us versus them, it made those scientists on the them side. And that was not good. It's frustrating because we could spend hours talking about all the things I disagreed with during the Trump administration. But one thing that Trump did that was good is he threw a whole lot of money at making a vaccine. I mean, he did not scrimp on the cash. He said, take all this money and do what you need to do. And if nothing else, that was a good policy decision. Okay. So whatever you want to criticize Trump for, that was a good decision. And it did kind of feel like they were trying to steal that from him, right? To take that away. And I can certainly see that causing people who supported Trump to say, oh, well, they're trying to, which is ironic now because so many people who are Trump supporters they make up the bulk of people who are refusing the vaccines right now. And I there's some mental gymnastics going on there that we could get into that relate to biases, but yes, the short answer is yes, that letter and things like that could have contributed to it, but not in a direct line.
How much do you think when it comes to vaccine hesitancy, some of it was that if you take the vaccine, you still need to wear a mask. If you take the vaccine, nothing changed behavior because, we've heard a lot of this. And I had people like, okay, well, you're telling me I'm going to take the vaccine and nothing going to change in terms of my behavior. I'm not really sure. If I take the vaccine, I should be able to do this and that. And I think there were lots of criticism sometimes where, well, yes, you take the vaccine, but you can't spend Thanksgiving with your relatives. Stay away from your. There was a lot of this where people.
The messaging was horrific. I have nothing good to say about the messaging. The challenge with that was when the vaccines first came out, one of the problems here is people don't fundamentally understand what vaccines do. Vaccines prevent disease, but vaccines do not necessarily prevent infection. And people the average layperson out there doesn't understand or didn't until this, they might now, but before the pandemic, the distinction between disease and infection, they may not have understood. Infection is the pathogen gets into your body and starts replicating, right? It sort of gets a foothold. Disease is it gets such a foothold that it leads it invokes an immune response to actually fight against it. And that immune response causes symptoms that you experience. Since most of the symptoms you experience with disease are actually your immune response. Not all of them, but most of them. A fever is an immune response, right? The vaccine's not causing the fever. The vaccine, vaccines can cause fevers, but the disease, the pathogen is not causing the fever. The pathogen is causing the immune response, which is the fever.
But I think the messaging was, I can quote so many even of my colleagues on Twitter and so on. The messaging was it's going to prevent infection. And I think,
and that's what I'm getting to is when
I think I'm talking like for the layman.
When it first came out, there was I remember this so well because I got into a lot of Twitter arguments and it was really frustrating. When it first came out, some people were trying to emphasize, hey, we don't know yet if this prevents infection. We only know that it prevents disease. And we need to proceed assuming that it doesn't prevent infection because very few vaccines actually prevent infection. The problem is we also had a cohort of people saying, oh no, people need this. They need to be able to say, I can take my mask off now because they got the vaccine. And there was not that infighting within the public health community was confusing to the public. And the whole idea of why they were even fighting was missed. The fact that, hey, there's a difference between infection and disease. We don't know yet if infection is prevented by this. So we need to wait and find out. And that's why you're still wearing a mask. Now, then in April, by the time April got there, we learned it does prevent infection. It actually did. And this is where it gets really tricky because again, the public's understanding of science is not as iterative as science actually is. And so the nuances and the ways in which science changes, people say, well, the science is changing. They don't realize what that really means. Science is always changing. It's a process. It's not a body of knowledge. In April, we found out the vaccines do prevent infection. And that was fantastic news. It was like, oh my gosh, it does prevent infection. This is great. The problem is the CDC took that and said, okay, we're going to use this as a carrot to encourage people to get vaccinated and say, okay, if you get vaccinated, you can take off your masks. And that was very poor decision on the CDC's part, because first of all, the behavioral research would have shown that people were not avoiding the vaccine because they didn't want to wear a mask. That was not an actual correlation. The people who were not wanting to get a vaccine, they had already stopped wearing masks. They were the ones who were already refusing masks. That was the correlation. And so the CDC's decision to say that in May, it made everything worse, because it gave carte blanche to every person who had not been vaccinated to say, oh, well, I'm not going to wear a mask now. And you had people on social media saying, I identify as vaccinated, making a joke about it and saying they're not going to wear the mask. And the other danger was not enough people had gotten the vaccine at that point. Access was poor.
But Tara, do you remember how much confusion was about the mask? Cloth mask, surgical mask. It's like it was all over the place.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that the CDC's decision to roll back the mask, it was a bad decision. It also made public health an individual health decision. And that's not how public health works. And there was no evidence that giving people the ability to remove their mask if they were vaccinated would encourage vaccination. There was zero evidence for that. Any behavioral scientist would have told you it wouldn't have worked, and it didn't work. And the problem is, once Delta came along, well, we then found out that the combination of waning from the vaccine and the higher infectiousness of Delta got past the vaccine, and it no longer prevented infection. So it did prevent infection for a couple of months. There was like the sweet spot. But then after those couple months went by, it was no longer able to prevent infection. And if the CDC hadn't rolled that back, it would have been a lot easier to message that.
So let me ask you a provocative question. Maybe it's not provocative, but maybe we can't prevent infection. There is no way we can get to zero COVID. The reality is.
Oh, no. When I say prevent infection, I don't mean zero COVID. Anybody who's promoting zero COVID is that's that went away in February of 2020. I don't know why anybody thought that was possible.
But some people did really think.
Oh, I know. And there's still people who do. And I think that's a very foolhardy position.
Yeah. And I think, like, I always think, like, whenever if the general public, when they see that, because again, we're trying to think of vaccine hesitancy. And I've said that before, I think the messaging has been so bad that if you're in the general public, you don't even know who to believe anymore.
Absolutely. That's one of the biggest problems.
Yes, zero COVID. COVID is here to stay. It's not going to go away. So one of the other things that obviously came up, Tara, is, the myocarditis risk. And there has been, some of this pertaining to children and some of it pertaining to adults. And we've seen some athletes who had some event.
There was the Olympic athlete recently who,
right. So I guess one of the things, as a physician myself, as an oncologist, which I really was upset about, and tell me if I was upset improperly. So,
okay.
But my sense is there is nothing wrong. There should be nothing wrong in me asking questions to understand adverse event of any intervention.
Absolutely.
I do that in oncology all the time. But the way things happen, like, I honestly, like, if you really dare to ask the question, like, if I would say I am concerned about myocarditis, I would be literally labeled, oh, how dare you? Like, there is no risk. I'm like, you know what? There is a risk, and I may be afraid about, so take me through. How did the myocarditis increase the divide? And do you think it also fueled vaccine hesitancy?
I definitely think it fueled vaccine hesitancy. And I definitely think that what you're saying is true, that the dialogue and the way we talk about it has. One of the problems is it depends on who you talk to. There are all these, pro-vaccine warriors on Twitter who are sort of fanatical about vaccines. And they tend to be the ones that are more, if you ask a question, they immediately jump on you. I had an interaction with one the other day because there's a mother on Twitter that I've interviewed her about her son who had myocarditis. And she was talking to another two people who were arguing with her about the risk. And I jumped in there and I was like, guys, this is a real risk. It might be, it happens this often or that often, but her simply mentioning this risk doesn't make her an anti-vaxxer. And I think that is a huge problem we've had. What's interesting is people assume that that's how doctors respond. most doctors, not all, there are definitely doctors who have a problem here too, but most doctors, especially, we'll talk about pediatricians. If you were to go to your pediatrician and say, I have these concerns, you are not, unless it's a bad pediatrician, when there's not, there's a couple of those, but not as many, you are not going to be treated like, oh, you're an anti-vaxxer, because those pediatricians have been dealing with those concerns for a long time, and they know it's completely legitimate to ask questions. We encourage people to ask questions about every medical intervention they have. Why should it be any different with vaccines? It's completely reasonable to say, well, what are the risks? And, am I in a group that would be more likely to experience those risks? So like with the J&J vaccine and blood clots, there is a risk group, just like with myocarditis, right? Teenage, adolescent boys have a higher risk. They're in a higher group. Women who are of childbearing age have a greater risk for the blood clots with the J&J vaccine. Those are reasonable questions to ask. And, it's reasonable to say, well, how bad is COVID going to be for me if I get it? And it's reasonable for you to say, well, how likely is it that I'm going to get COVID, right? All of those things are reasonable questions, and people should be able to ask them without being shamed, without being accused of fitting some category. And good doctors and infectious disease doctors and pediatricians and people who have dealt with vaccine hesitancy before will respond honestly. If you go and listen to Paul Offit's talks, he's very clear about the risks and will not malign someone because they've asked that question. But there's a whole bunch of other people, including some doctors on Twitter, who are just, really strident. I mean, Twitter's not the place for nuance.
And it's not, honestly, I don't think Twitter is the real world.
No, it's not the real world. It's this weird microcosm of
very, very, very.
Yeah,
weird.
But so yeah, people will get jumped on, and that definitely increases hesitancy, because if you're trying to ask a reasonable question that you would ask about any medical intervention, and someone says, oh, you're a crazy blah blah blah, and
I can tell you,
it's going to push you away. It's going to push you away.
I can tell you with my kids who are young boys, teenage boys, I was very nervous about myocarditis because,
and that's reasonable,
right? I mean, we're all vaccinated in the household, and I literally, to your point, I was calculating if their teachers are vaccinated, I'm vaccinated, my wife is vaccinated, what are the risks? And then we decided to go ahead with the vaccines, but I was very uncomfortable giving 3 weeks in advance, a 3-week duration, because I felt that there was really data after the second dose to be more this. And I ended up actually spreading it to 6 weeks. And then I gave them—
That sounds reasonable to me. Yeah.
Right. But I can tell you, actually, for literally, I did not admit this until 6 months later on one of my podcast shows, because I knew there were, if I ever say that publicly, people will say you're crazy, you're a physician.
Yeah, that's part of that whole rhetoric is part of the problem. That whole us versus them binary. One of the important points I make in my TEDx talk, and every time I talk about vaccine hesitancy, I emphasize this, is that vaccine hesitancy is a spectrum. It's not like you are pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. There are some people who fall into those categories, but they're at the far ends of the spectrum. Most people fall somewhere along that spectrum where they have this concern or that concern, or they feel mostly confident about vaccines, but they worry that this vaccine was done too quickly and they want to be reassured about why the speed doesn't compromise the safety, or, it's not, it's totally normal to be along that spectrum.
Like with boosters right now, there's a lot of these things about boosters, which I think is also fueling hesitancy, because, I think Paul Offit, I believe you actually mentioned him. He does actually, in one of the articles I read, he does have some concerns about boosters for young.
Yeah, he disagrees with boosters for adolescent boys right now.
I mean, if Paul Offit disagrees with boosters for adolescent boys, I feel like, and there are other people who are making louder noise on Twitter and social media that we should boost everybody and all of that. How do we reconcile this? Because that does fuel.
It's not, I mean, unfortunately, because our public health system is in shambles right now, it does end up coming to you to try to figure that out, and it's hard. So that goes back to the trust issue. You have to figure out who you trust. And ideally you want to find medical professionals that have the expertise in that area that you trust. And, if you have a couple of them and they disagree, then you're going to have to take their arguments and consider it. Offit's arguments for boosting boys have more to do with the fact that he doesn't think that the boys are at a higher risk for getting the disease.
Right.
It's not so much because the myocarditis, we don't have, so far the data on booster shots does not show a big increased risk for myocarditis. It's mostly the second shot. If you make it past the second shot, you're not looking at a big risk with the third shot. And I think his partly probably also is influenced by belief that we need to be focusing more on global vaccination, which I agree with. And it's not a zero-sum thing, but it is, I do think that America has not done enough to vaccinate the world, and that is a problem. We've been focusing so much on booster shots locally. Are we doing enough to ensure that other countries are vaccinated? Because that affects our public health too. It's not just us being generous, like it's actually necessary. And he is in the minority on that, but I mean, he explains his rationale for that, and he still explains that he thinks that, teenage boys in general should definitely get the first 2 shots. One of the things that frustrated me about the myocarditis discussion, and it's the reason I sort of dug into it deep for my National Geographic article, is that I kept hearing people say, you have a higher risk of myocarditis with COVID than you do with the vaccine. Full stop. And that's all they said. They didn't say anything else after that. And when I started digging into it, first of all, the heart effects that you experience with the vaccine and the heart effects that you experience with COVID are not the same. Myocarditis, classic sort of viral induced myocarditis, is actually pretty rare among kids and teens with COVID. It doesn't happen very often. As your age goes up, the risk goes up. And which is interesting, because with the myocarditis with the shot, the risk goes up as the age goes down, right? So there's this weird sort of one going up, one going down. And then if you go down low enough, children like under 12 have a much higher risk of MIS-C, and that has a very different cardiac effect. It's still an inflammation of the heart, but it's not myocarditis. It's similar, it's myocarditis-like. And so it gets hard to discuss it. Now, when you look at it, when you step back and look, okay, let's look at this not as myocarditis versus myocarditis, but cardiac effects versus cardiac effects. When you look at it that way, yes, the risk of cardiac effects that you should worry about are much greater with COVID than the myocarditis that's experienced with the vaccine.
I think what's missing in this.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think I agree. I think what's missing sometimes, we don't factor in the risk of catching the infection as well, because
yes, that's part of it. And we also don't factor in the other stuff that COVID does. Like there was this this sort of like, laser focus on myocarditis, and there was the vast kinds of disability that can occur, of the loss of school that can occur. There's all these other things. Or one of the most important things in my family, my husband's immune compromised. The reason my kids are vaccinated, I vaccinated them to protect themselves, sure. But the biggest reason I vaccinated my kids is if they brought COVID home to their dad, they might make themselves orphans. And I couldn't have my kids living the rest of their lives knowing they might have killed their dad. So I think the fact that kids are vectors is often left out of the discussion as well. We think about vaccination only as protecting kids. But with looking at the risk of catching the disease, in the case of COVID, this is something a lot of doctors said to me, and I agree with it. It's never, it's not if, it's when. You are going to be exposed to COVID.
I totally agree with that. Totally agree with that. And you know what? Can I tell you something? When I was saying that, I was also trolled, because like, oh my God, no, you can't get COVID. Like, you know what? And then all of a sudden on social media, I started seeing all of my colleagues who were masked, double vaxxed, boosted, and they're showing their test results that they were positive. Like,
one thing that was good about Omicron, one thing I'm glad for with Omicron is it finally got rid of that ridiculous moral superiority of infection. This idea that if you did everything right, you wouldn't get infected and you were better than everybody else.
Thank you for saying that.
That was bullshit. Sorry to excuse my language.
No, it's unfiltered. You can say whatever you want.
Okay. Yeah, no, that was that whole idea that, oh, you got COVID, you must have done something wrong. That was total bullshit. And it was wrong. It caused shaming of disease. It made people who really did do quote unquote everything right and got COVID feel shame when they shouldn't have felt shame, which could have affected, the ability to get treatment. That made me so angry. So, the one good thing about Omicron is that it made it almost impossible to escape, so that everybody who was like the good little girls and boys who had done everything right got it anyway. That sounds awful to say, but I just, that whole narrative of, you got COVID because you acted badly was a bad narrative.
That is, you're so right. And it pissed me off a lot, like you said.
No, it was wrong. It was so wrong.
It is so hard to believe we are doing this so far. I mean, this long, and we're still having this issue. Couple of things, Tara, just I'm curious your thoughts, because again, what have you developed any thoughts about? I don't want to tell you my thoughts, but maybe you've seen them on social media about school closure for kids. What are your thoughts there?
That one gets really complicated. Okay. In general, we know that the best place for kids to be is in school learning. Okay. That's been unequivocally shown in terms of mental health, educational benefits. The problem I've seen is, first of all, there's not a one size fits all for this. Everyone wants to say this is what should happen across the country, when the country has a lot of differences in how, in resources and political beliefs and so on. Saying that kids should be in school no matter what, full stop, is just as bad to me as saying kids should not be in school no matter what. They're equally bad because they don't take into account things that are going on in the schools. All things being equal, if we could have every single school have kids required to wear KN95s and stick a HEPA filter or two in every classroom, and that you can't really social distance in the classroom, so forget that. But eat outside as much as possible at lunch, and that's about all you can probably do in a school. And do that, then if all schools are doing that, all kids should be attending school, but except the ones who have reasons not to. I believe that a virtual option, not a requirement, a virtual option should exist in every single school. And the reason I believe that is because there are some kids who, first of all, there's some kids who actually do better on virtual. There needs to be and when I say virtual option, I mean a virtual option that is a high quality option, because there's a lot of crap virtual options out there, right? Some virtual has been done well and some has done very poorly. I actually taught at a virtual school back in 2012, long before the pandemic. And it worked really well. Virtual school can be very effective when it's planned to be. And there are certain kids who thrive better in that. Kids who have special needs, kids who are not particularly needing the social aspect. If they're introverted and they can get the social that they need virtually. But then you've got kids who have, very health conditions that put them, even with a KN95 on every kid, even with the HEPA filters, they are so fragile.
Do you really think that kids should be masked at school?
Yes, I do right now. And I do whenever it's high community prevalence. I do believe that. I'm talking like kindergarten and up, I don't think that makes sense in preschool.
Because the WHO and Europe, they actually don't do that. The WHO recommends above 6 only. The CDC here recommends above 2. And what I did, you may laugh at this, what I did is I decided to do my own real world evidence experiments in my kids' school. Okay. This is my own observational study. So that's Shadi walking into the school and taking a look. And our school, just to give you an idea, which is a little bit strange, I think, it's 100% teachers vaccinated and 90% of all of the kids are vaccinated.
Yeah, that's very unusual.
It's very unusual. And the 10% who are not vaccinated, they must test weekly. Just so
that's extremely unusual.
It's very unusual. I think 89% to be accurate vaccinated, and they still have mask mandates, just so you know.
Right.
So I walked into the school, and here's my observation. My observation is that all kinds of masks were being used.
Right.
B, I would say probably less than 50% were wearing the masks properly. You're gonna wear properly. It's kind of all over the place. Yeah. And I was trying to I was thinking, like, this is how it happens in the real world. Like,
yes.
The reality is, like, if it were me, I would say, like, you know what? We recommend you wear it if you want to, but we can't mandate it because nobody is really doing it right. Like, I'm not sure what the mandate is.
Well, it depends on, to go back from it, what I was saying about the virtual, I withdrew my kids in July of 2021 because or 2020, actually.
Yeah, 2020, we were
Yeah.
virtual as well. Yeah.
Or was, no, 2021. I'm right. I'm trying to
We
remember.
actually,
Yeah,
in
for the
our
year,
school,
sorry.
yeah, in
I
our
think
school
the years run together. And the reason is my husband is immune compromised, as I mentioned before. We're in Texas. The governor here said you're not allowed to require masks in school. And, I actually was able to get my kids vaccinated a little bit earlier because one of them I put into a trial. He was in the Moderna trial. And the other one, I don't mind saying this because I did what I did. He's 11. I lied and said he was 12. I went to Walmart. I put down the wrong birth date and he got the vaccine at 11 because in our family, the risks of my husband getting infected were so great. Ours is a special case. Not everyone has an immune compromised person at their house. But the problem is I had no choice but to withdraw my kids from school because the school was not doing the mitigation procedures necessary to protect my kids from getting coronavirus, bringing it home and killing their father. So that's why I wanted a virtual option. Now, I don't think any kid should be forced into a virtual option, but I think we can have a situation where we mitigate as much as possible in the schools. We offer the virtual option for those, for the edge cases that are a little bit more excessive. And the reason I think it's important to have the masks in the schools, first of all, our messaging on masks has been shit from the beginning, right? We did not adequately, cloth masks are not very effective. I guess they're better than nothing sometimes, but they're not very effective. And the fact that we didn't address that much earlier was part of the problem. I do agree that you're never going to have 100% compliance in a school. They're kids, okay? But you don't look at, oh, there's 5 kids who have the mask below their nose, therefore why should we bother having a mask mandate? Because that's kind of like saying, oh, well, there's going to be, these 5 guys who are going to go and buy a gun anyway and shoot up a school. So why should we have any gun laws at all? That's the same argument, right?
I think the pushback that maybe I have, or maybe others will have, is that if your kids are vaccinated, and even if obviously your husband is also vaccinated and you're vaccinated, and even if they catch something despite the vaccination, the reality is it's going to be an infection. It's not going to be a disease, right? I mean, even with
that's not necessarily true. No, you can be vaccinated and get, vaccines are not 100% for the disease either. You can have a vaccine and you can get the disease and you can end up hospitalized. It's much less likely than if you're unvaccinated, but it is possible. And when you're immune compromised, people who are immune compromised have some people who are immune compromised, like people who are organ recipients, okay, they're taking medication that suppresses the immune system. I have a friend who got 3 vaccines. She still is testing with no antibodies because she's on 3 different drugs to suppress her immune system. So just because you're vaccinated, especially if you're immune compromised, that does not mean you won't die. You can still die. And that's why those are the people that I think are actually getting left behind in the pandemic. We're just not even thinking about them. It's like they don't matter. And that's, we have to remember that this is a public health problem. And public health can't be changed into individual health, which is what so many people want it to become. It's just not. I wish it were, but it's not.
To your point about messaging, if you recall, the CDC director Walensky a couple of weeks ago was on TV. She's talking about the deaths were happening in people with comorbidities.
Oh God, that was such awful.
Do you remember that? I mean, this was.
Oh, awful. I remember it very well because there was a whole bunch. I'm involved in a lot of, on Twitter, I follow a lot of disability advocates, and
this was not good. This was not good.
Yeah, and that's, people want to read what I've written about this. I've written about immune compromised people and vaccines at National Geographic, and I did an op-ed at Wired about immune compromised people being left behind. I tweeted one from one of my editors, John Gluckman at Medium, who did a good article on this in the Washington Post. We have to recognize that people who have disabilities, people who are immune compromised, these people have value in society. They matter too, just as the people who can't wear a mask because of disabilities, that we can't forget them either. There are kids who have autism who do not have the ability to wear a mask because of sensory issues. And that's also important. And some of those kids may be better at home with virtual. Some of those kids may need to go to school, which means you do have to accommodate that also. And so I think there's just not enough awareness and acknowledgement and acceptance of all those different versions, right? The people who can't wear masks, the people who get the vaccine, but they're still not well protected. And that's why we have multiple mitigation measures. But all that nuance has been lost. It's turned into a political, it's turned into political basketball or something. I don't know a good analogy, ping pong, whatever. It's turned into a political game where discussion of masks, it signifies a political identity or belief system rather than actually considering the evidence. The evidence shows that cloth masks are next to worthless. Surgical masks are a lot better. KN95s are better than that. N95s are the gold standard, but you know what? They don't make N95s for kids. So don't talk about putting N95s for kids because they don't exist. We're not even mentioning those things in a rational way. We're just trying to score political points. No, kids absolutely should not all be forced to stay home from school. But you know what has now happened in Texas, because they don't require masks and they're not allowed to. They only quote unquote encourage them. We don't have high vaccination rates because we have a lot of vaccine hesitancy in this area. And my son's school district, even though he's in an all virtual school, but that virtual school is part of a regular public school district, they closed last Thursday and Friday. They didn't close because they were trying to prevent infection. They closed because they literally had so many adults that were sick that they couldn't keep a school open. And that's what you end up with when you get to the point where school districts are begging parents to apply for being subs, and you're grabbing some random guy off the street to be a warm body in a classroom. Are those kids still getting the best education in in-person school? Are you telling me that in-person school is best no matter what, even if you have a sub for 17 days that's different on each day because the teachers are all sick? Because that's not a better education. Maybe you need to go to virtual school for just 2 weeks, let some of the, flatten the curve a bit and then come back or rotate. But those solutions aren't being discussed. And instead, it's all, it's New York saying everybody stay home no matter what. And it's Texas saying everybody go to school no matter what. And in New York, you've got kids who need to be in school and could be in school safely. And in Texas, you've got kids who can't go to school because their teachers are so sick the schools have shut down on their own.
We could talk about this forever.
I'm very passionate about this.
I know.
So frustrating.
But here's my last question for you, and then we'll let you go, and hopefully we'll.
Okay, sorry.
I want to bring you back. There's a lot to talk about. My last question for you. That's in 60 seconds or less. A year from now, Tara Haelle is with me on Healthcare Unfiltered. Where do you think we will be a year from now in 2023? February 2023?
I don't know. I can't speculate because we don't know what variants will happen next. We could get a worse variant, or maybe Omicron got us all so, we have such high herd immunity from Omicron that the worst is behind us. I really don't know. I don't want to speculate because, anybody who, none of us could have predicted Omicron, right? We were all, as of a few days before Thanksgiving, my husband and I were discussing whether to send our kids back to school in January. Well, the day after Thanksgiving, that all went to hell. So nobody saw Omicron coming, nobody. And if nobody saw that coming between now and a year, Jesus, what could happen? Who knows? I can't even.
Well, that's another excuse. That's another excuse to bring you back.
Okay, sounds good.
Tara, thank you so much for spending this hour with me. I really appreciate all of your insights and your willingness to come in and take some tough questions.
No worries.